Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our August webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started in just 1 second. Share my screen here. All right, perfect. Can everybody see my screen okay? Awesome. Well, for anybody who this is your first Paragus IT webinar, welcome. We're glad to have you here. Just a really quick introduction to who we are. Paragus is a 100% employee-owned company based in Western and Central Massachusetts, and we serve approximately 130 organizations as their outsourced IT department. And from time to time, we get this question of what how does IT play into us either being acquired, our valuation, or us doing an acquisition of another company? And we've had the very fortunate opportunity to participate in the due diligence of several acquisitions that our clients were doing, where we've had a chance to kind of go through the IT of the company that they're consider buying and provide recommendations and concerns and point out some potential issues to the potential acquirer. And it's a topic that we don't hear a lot of people talking about often. And so we thought it might make an interesting subject for a webinar. So that's why we're here today, is to talk about kind of what is the impact of your IT, your technology on something like your business's valuation, and how would it impact a potential acquisition or integration or merger with another firm? And what are some of the things that you might want to be doing proactively now to strengthen your environment to get ready for something like that? Just a quick introduction. I am Delcy Bean. I'm the founder and CEO of Paragus IT. And I'm going to be really talking about this from the IT perspective and kind of from our firsthand experience. In a few minutes, I'm going to be handing over the presentation to Michael Vann, who's here from the Vann Group, who's going to be talking about it from kind of the M&A side of the house and talking about what he has seen in the many, many, many transactions that he's been a part of. So I'll start with just understanding IT maturity a little bit. In the world of business, IT is no longer just a support function. It's a core driver of value. But not all IT is created or set up equally. In our experience, companies generally tend to fall into one of two very broad camps: businesses that are operating strategically and businesses that are operating reactively. Reactive IT is generally about putting out fires. Systems break, security incidents happen, software becomes outdated, and the IT team scrambles to fix it, often right before the deadline. While this might keep things running in the short term, it does come at an organizational cost. Constant disruptions, missed opportunities for innovation, and higher unplanned expenses can make your technology feel more like a liability than an asset. And when it's time for evaluation, investors see this as a risk, and risk lowers value. On the other hand, strategic IT takes a proactive, forward-thinking approach. It's about aligning technology with business goals, anticipating needs, strengthening cybersecurity before an incident occurs, and investing in systems that support scalability. Strategic IT not only reduces downtime and unexpected costs, it demonstrates to potential buyers, investors, and partners that your business is stable, efficient, and prepared for growth. That stability translates directly into higher valuation. So here's the takeaway. If your IT strategy is reactive, you're not just losing time and money, you're potentially lowering the value of your company. Strategic IT turns technology into a competitive advantage, and in the eyes of the market, that's worth a premium. So when we talk about IT maturity, what we're really asking is, does the way the company approaches IT today create a competitive advantage, or is it simply the cost of doing business? So IT maturity means moving beyond that break fix or reactive support. It's all about aligning your IT strategy with your business's goals. It's about being proactive, and it's about leveraging technology for growth. Mature IT enables scalability, it improves your security, and it improves your efficiency. Companies with mature IT are far less likely to face costly downtime or very expensive and embarrassing security breaches. When you get this right, IT becomes a driver of value, not just a budget line item. It also enables faster decision making through better data visibility, which creates competitive differentiation. Companies can innovate more quickly. They may have stronger customer experiences because operations are running smoother. There's a risk to organizations who have low maturity. Often, organizations with low maturity are acting reactively, they're putting out fires, which means they face higher risk. There could be greater cybersecurity gaps, compliance failures, or inefficiencies. This erodes enterprise value rather than adding to it. So, to answer the question, yes, IT maturity is a business advantage. It can increase enterprise value, reduce risk, and create opportunities for innovation. Companies that invest in IT maturity position themselves to not just keep up, but to get ahead. And then the last thing I want to talk about is something that we have just started really getting into, which is how do we use AI to capitalize on data to increase enterprise value? A lot of organizations are sitting on a lot of data. If you've been in business for 5, 10, 15, 20, sometimes 50 or 100 years, you have a lot of information. And to you, that data may not have a lot of value right now, which means it doesn't have almost any value to the company acquiring you, which means it's not going to increase your enterprise value at all during a transaction. However, AI gives us the ability to turn that data into an asset that we actually can leverage for an increased valuation. And it could be an asset that we may even be able to trademark or get a patent for that would allow us to also create intellectual property that can be added to the transaction value. So, how do we do that? We're all sitting on all of this data, but we're not capitalizing on it. What AI lets us do is to take that data and productize it, turn it into a decision making tool, turn it into a forecasting tool, turn it into some other intellectual property that is going to be interesting or exciting or have value to a potential acquirer as well as to you. And if you're leveraging this data and you're not quite ready to sell the business today, you may be able to grow your enterprise value by putting that data to use, by helping you make better decisions, smarter decisions, faster decisions about your business. And that ultimately is going to improve the business and therefore increase its long term value as well. So, this is a really key, very new opportunity that we're trying to help businesses see the opportunity in and really take advantage of. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Vann.
Thanks,
Welcome,
Delcy.
Michael.
Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. So I'll just give you kind of a quick background on who I am and who the Vann Group is. We're a strategic consulting and transactional advisory firm here in the Springfield area, but we work sometimes nationally, sometimes globally, but predominantly throughout New England. We work with mostly small, mid-sized enterprises. In the M&A world, it's kind of called the lower middle market of companies, and we work with them in developing their value proposition, their leadership teams to get ready, transaction ready, and then we handle the transaction when they're ready to go to market, or if they've gotten approached by a buyer and need someone to manage that process for them. Delcy, you can kind of flip the slide. So, Delphi had reached out and said, we're going to do this webinar and this topic, and we really would love to have someone who could talk about it from the transactional side and the valuation side, and where does IT come into play um, in that process. And so the way to understand it is where IT pops up is in due diligence. And due diligence is sort of broken down into three stages. So if you've got an intermediary like me who's working with someone, with you as a client and you're out to market, the first stage of due diligence is when you've got contact from a buyer. They're going to reach out and they're going to get this confidential information memorandum that tells them about the company, see if they're interested in it. So that's kind of the first check for a buyer, is to say, does this company look interesting to us or not? If it is, they start to engage, and that's when we move into the second stage of due diligence. And this is where they really start to put together some thinking on, well, what is the value of this company? What about it do we like? What are those red flags that are potentially showing up? And do we want to actually acquire it? And, so the IT at that stage is and assume that the company is okay with it, that, it's got the check boxes on it. What happens is once an offer is accepted, you're now into the full due diligence process. And this is where, we call where the devil in the details lives, because now this is where the buyers get really, really, really deep into everything and anything about your company. Their objective is to know more about your company than you do. And so this is where they start digging deep into financials and to your regulatory issues. And IT is one of those because what they're looking for are risk factors. Where does the company create risk for a potential buyer? And that's when we start to see the impact, not so much on valuation, although that can sometimes happen there, but on deal structures and terms, right? So in Delcy can probably tell you a lot about what goes on in the due diligence aspect of the IT side of it, but I've been through it numerous times, and they come at you with this incredibly long checklist of everything under the sun that they want to know about. And you go, oh my God, we have never even thought about some of these things, right, if we haven't done our homework. Our buyers are looking at those things and saying, where are those potential risks for us? Where are those landmines? It could be something really simple like, we don't have accurate software licenses. We've got, you know, we've got 10 people working on one license. Oh, well, that's going to cost us something to get up to speed. So those things start to come up. And those things may or may not impact the valuation, but if there's big things that start to pop up, you're going to see a change potentially in the valuation today. But what you may see is how the buyer is going to protect themselves from a risk standpoint. And that's where you get really in the devil in the details of the indemnification language and the representations and warranties. And what you're saying in those things is basically representations and warranties are statements of fact. This is what we say is true. You don't need to worry about it. If there's a problem, you can come back at us for some amount of money. Sometimes, if those risks are seen as really big, like we've got potential strong data breaches of customer information or things like that, you could see the potential for your entire purchase price to get clawed back. So the risk side of it isn't so much like that's seen immediately. It's when they're really deep into the deal. You're so close to closing. You've been spending money left and right, and you can visualize this exit, and then they come, hold up. We've got this problem, and we're going to have to restructure our deal. We're going to have to put some more of this risk on your side of it. So it's a pretty stressful time, and it's one that can be completely avoided, if you've got your IT in place, your cybersecurity metrics, and everything is checked the box. You don't have to worry about it because it's no longer a risk factor. It becomes just a check the box. You can flip slides, Dust, or well, I can just kind of flow into it, so we don't have to play with the deck. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is what are those red flags that pop up in the M&A process that are going to impact your valuation? And the way to think about valuation in a deal process is there's two things that always come up in play. One is, well, what's that EBITDA of the company? And then the second is, well, what are those risk factors? And the way to think about this is that EBITDA number, if everyone's familiar with that, it's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And that's basically what's being valued. So a buyer is looking at the stability and the growth potential of that EBITDA. And the larger the EBITDA, potentially the higher the value of the company and the multiple because there's less perceived risk. So EBITDA is one factor, the valuation. The second factor that comes into play now are all those risk factors, which is what influences that multiple. And so when our buyers start to think about what's this company worth, they're starting from a high level look at, well, we like the EBITDA fits our size, we like the market the company's in, we like what it does, we like the revenue stream. People seem nice. What do we start to get into? And the red flags start to come up. First, the first one kind of in that process is in that first stage of due diligence. Now, we never set a purchase price on a company for sale because all you're doing is competing with yourself. If you do that, you set a ceiling on the value rather than a floor. But a smart buyer is going to say, hey, Mike, or whoever your intermediary is, what are they really looking for? And so that first red flag that popped up is if I come up with a range that is far above expectation. So I have an unrealistic seller, right? So if your valuation range is outside of what the market considers normal for your company, you don't even get to the valuation discussion because they go, oh, forget this. We're not going to put the time and energy into looking at this deal. The other thing that happens up, the other red flag is we'll talk about the inconsistency in the financial performance. Right? It's a big red flag when we see fluctuations in revenue, fluctuations in margin, fluctuations in profitability. Buyers are looking for consistency, or they're looking for a trajectory that's going like this, not like this. So that's a big red flag early on in the process. And if I see those, or if a buyer sees those, what they see is a company doesn't have a good grasp on their business, whether that's the leadership team, whether it's the market's crazy, or whatever it may be. So that's the red flag that pops up early. If we assume we can get past those and into this next stage, like that second stage of due diligence, um, what we're looking for now is we're starting to have conversations with this buyer. We may have gotten some general valuation parameters and deal structure with them. Now they're starting to validate that, do we really want to make an offer and buy this company? And so one of the red flags that we see here, and it's kind of an interesting one, is what's your growth story? Right. So a buyer wants to know, well, why has your business done what it's doing? And what's the confidence level and how you're going to get there in the future? And if I don't have a good growth story with my buyer, or I mean, my seller, it's a red flag because I don't have the confidence that this team that I'm going to invest in or this company I'm going to buy in actually knows what they're doing. And so if they can't tell a good story about their growth plan, where they've been, a buyer is frequently going to walk away, or they're going to factor that risk into the valuation, which means lower multiple. So that's one of those stages there. The other one that really starts to come into play um, is the reliance on the ownership and the leadership team. Um, buyers get nervous about businesses that rely on the owner because that owner is going away or most likely going to go away. And so if the company is running through, if all the major decisions, all those things are happening during that stage, well, that's a big risk factor. So that gets the impact on the valuation. That's a red flag for someone. The other red flag within that range is management team turnover. So how stable is your management team? If I'm seeing that your top positions, your VP of sales or VP of operations or your CFO or whatever are turning frequently, if they've got 12 months, 24 months with the company, I get nervous. What's going on inside culturally with that company? Is the owner a real head case? And that's why people are burning out. What's going on? So that's a really big red flag now that starts to get me to look deeper into this company and understanding it. And what is the risk associated with that? When we get into that third stage of things, in that really deep quality of due diligence stage, the thing that really pops is the quality of earnings. So the quality of your financial statements. Buyers today, even for small companies, are far more sophisticated than they used to be. Back in, not to age myself, but when I first started doing M&A deals, you'd have your accountant who might take a quick look at things and go, yeah, let's do some, yep, the bank statements balanced and those types of things. Today, they're bringing in accounting firms who are doing a quality of earnings report, which is a really deep, deep dive into your financials. They'll ask you questions like, well, why did your electric bill go up in July? Things that seem irrelevant, but they're going to get into that and they're going to understand, the quality of your vendors and your customers and are they safe and secure? So if you don't have good financials and if you can't pass through that quality of earnings, major red flag. And that can also result in either a change into the valuation because they're going to reprice it, or it's going to change in that deal structure because they're going to put more risk on to you as the seller. So those are some of the things that we see as kind of those immediate red flags that will impact your value and can also impact your ability to get your deal done. So that,
Awesome. Thank you,
thanks,
Michael
Mary.
and Delcy.
Sure.
Appreciate it. So we're just going to shift into a panel discussion. If anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to drop them in at any time, and I will weave them into this discussion. So just want to go back to you, Delcy, a little bit what you were talking about with IT maturity. Can you share an example of a client who moved from firefighting to strategic IT and kind of the impact that that had on them and their business?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, I think there's a couple different times we've seen it, but most commonly, one of the things that can help with that process is a company faces some compliance obligation. And we've actually seen this backfire as well, where somebody's trying to be acquired, the acquiring company wants them to be a certain level of compliance, whether that's a NIST compliance, federal, state, governmental compliance. But often those compliances not only can help make the business more attractive, they also can create an urgency or a motivation to mature the IT. So, for example, right now, one of the things we're dealing a lot with is helping manufacturers become what is called CMMC compliant. And as we go through that process, we're using a NIST framework, which is a federal framework published by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. I think I have that right. And the framework happens to be called 800-171. And it's a very good framework for IT maturity. It was a lot of research and thought was put into what does a really mature, stable, strong IT environment look like, putting that into 110 different items. And as we work with clients to achieve this compliance, oftentimes, for better or for worse, we actually are moving them from a very reactive, disorganized, somewhat disjointed environment, sometimes some pretty extreme cases, to a very mature, very streamlined, very efficient IT environment. And that process isn't always without pain. We describe it sometimes a little bit like when you're renovating an old house, you start taking down the walls and pulling up the floorboards, and you don't know what you're going to find. And it's often worse than you thought it was and more expensive and takes longer. It's not always the fastest, cleanest, simplest process. But on the other side, if you stick with it and you don't lose focus on the outcome, you end up in a really good place. And I think that's probably been the most recent transformations we've seen is some, older manufacturing companies have been around for 25, 30, 50 years that haven't really focused on IT, now coming into the 21st century and having really strong guidelines and procedures and policies as well as technology behind it.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Michael, a question for you.
Sure.
How do you know that your IT and cybersecurity infrastructure and organization is going to become an issue during due diligence? Is there any telltale signs that you're able, I know you touched on this a little bit, but is there
Yeah.
anything in addition that can kind of raise red flags?
So one of the questions that we'll ask during our beginning process is, how do you feel about your IT and your system here? How confident are you in it? And I always say, if you've got like a provider like Paragus, like, have you done everything they've told you to do? And if the answer is, well, no, there's some things that we've missed or anything, or like we haven't really got this to do, we're behind. I go, okay, those are going to be where the issues are going to lie, because Paragus knows exactly how to get your systems compliant, where you're supposed to be. So for us, like I said, from an M&A standpoint, we're always looking at those risk factors, which ones are check the box I don't have to worry about. And if I can't check that box early on in those questions, I know there's going to be a potential problem. And hopefully there's enough time to fix it. But if there's not, then we're going to kind of hope and pray that the buyer isn't sophisticated enough to figure it out, or they gloss over it. But it does start to create some stress in the process, because we know due diligence is where buyers look to find weaknesses. And when they find weaknesses, it gives them an opportunity to retrade or to change the terms of a deal. So the fewer of those things that we can have, the better off you are, because then you're dealing from a position of strength. So like, if you don't ask that, if you can't answer that first question well, then we've got to start to work on that, because it could potentially be a problem.
Yeah, and a little bit to that point, Michael, I'm sure you in transactions are faced with this question of, is it going to be a stock sale or an asset sale? And I know that
Mhm.
most sellers want it to be a stock sale and a lot of buyers want it to be an asset sale. And what we have actually seen is we had a client doing an acquisition. They got close to the finish line. It was scheduled to be a stock sale. At the end of the day, they found that there was so much cyber liability that they did not want to inherit, and the buyer didn't want to basically provide the right reps and warranties to exempt them from it. And so they ended
Yep.
up switching it to an asset sale just out of protection. We don't want to inherit this potential liability. There's lawsuits and breaches and all these things that are lingering out there that could come to surface, and we don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, and that's a great example. Like, when you're acquiring the stock of a company, you're buying all those hidden liabilities, not just the ones that are seen. So again, if those things start to pop up, it could change your term of your deal. And where the difference, a lot of times for companies, that difference between asset and stock is the taxation level of it. So a stock transaction, great, capital gains. An asset, you might have a lot more ordinary income. So, it could be a difference of 20% on your purchase price. So it's a really big issue if you're suddenly planning on a sale based on a stock sale, and suddenly the buyer says, guess what? We're not doing that. Now you're deep into a transaction. You have to decide, am I going to take this haircut or not?
Yeah, in that same token, if during due diligence something like that is discovered, I know this isn't a one size fits all answer, but how much can that impact the value of a company?
Depend, yeah. So you're right. It's not a one fit, and it's going to depend. And so it's going to look at, are they one-time costs, or are they a fundamental change to the financial structure of the company, the operating costs? If it's okay, a one-time cost, well, maybe there's a no reduction, or a buyer kind of builds in some of that fudge factor, so to speak. But if it's things now that are going to be an increased ongoing cost that change that model, they may come back and say, guess what? We're going to drop the value here, or we're going to put more into the performance component of the transaction, right? So they may modify that if it's sizable enough. They're not going to get upset like, well, your computers are too old. That's part of the overall capex, but it's those other things that could be really big expenditures, or big gotcha moments down the line.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Switching gears a little bit, Delcy, can you talk about how strong IT systems can reduce the risk during leadership transitions or rapid growth?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mary. So I think what we see is when a company experiences rapid growth, everything gets stressed. The whole system just gets an additional layer of stress applied to it. If the system was already fragile and already maybe kind of at its breaking point, that stress can have huge impact and you can start to see things fall apart. You can start to see systems go down. You can see security breaches. You can see unintentional access to data that wasn't meant to be. You can see all kinds of these little cracks start to emerge, and those cracks can quickly spread and cause real problem. At the same time, with leadership transition, and Mike spoke about this a little bit, a lot of immature IT systems are still overly dependent on the leaders in the organization. They know the idiosyncrasies, they know how it works, they know where all the duct tape and bubble gum is that keeps it all together. And it works as long as they're there to answer every question and to oversee everything. The second you start to transition a team out and somebody really wants to step back and not have to jump in every time this weird error message comes up because we haven't patched this software because it's not compatible with this tool and we've just been band-aiding it for 15 years, you bring that team back in or you have a disruption because you don't have access to that team, depending on what the situation is. So where we have seen these investments really pay off is it just allows the organization to handle things like leadership transitions or scale without stressing the system or without having the system start to crumble or crack. And that's everything from the way that your servers are configured, the way your Active Directory is, the way users are onboarded, the way computers are set up. A lot of companies realized during COVID they weren't set up to have people work remotely, and that was a huge stress on the system. But a lot of times, scale does require remote workforce or opening up offices that are not geographically central to where you are. All of those things are going to be cracks and they could be stumbling blocks. They're like, okay, we got to pause, we got to solve that. We had to put everything on hold while we figure out how to handle this. Or all of that foundation is there and you're just growing and growing and growing because the foundation is designed to support that growth and can handle it.
And if I could elaborate on it too, Mary, is what we see with our growth organizations and transition organizations is, as they're getting larger, the need for faster, more effective decision making comes into play. And a lot of their systems don't have that capability, right? They've got maybe a CRM, maybe they've got QuickBooks, maybe they've got all these things that don't talk to each other. So when we're talking about decision making for that leadership team, it's hard because they don't have access to the data they need. And so that becomes problematic in the due diligence side because the buyer's asking for things that we don't have. So that puts stress on our team. On the flip side of it, though, is when you've now sold and you've got this leadership team and we've got performance metrics tied to that purchase price, and we don't have good systems, we don't have a good process, we're behind the eight ball when it comes to maximizing our earnout values. So one of the big investments that we talk to companies about when they're getting ready and they've got time is, what's your single source of truth? What's that, whether it's an ERP or whatever, how are you going to do this? Because it's a critical piece on that transition, and it's also going to make your due diligence go a lot smoother when we've got easy access to the information we need to get to the buyer, as well as to make our decisions today and going forward.
Yeah, Mike, that reminds me of an analogy that a speaker once used at a conference, and it's always stuck with me. And he said, imagine you're in a race car and they've put cardboard over the windshield and the dashboard. If you're going 5 miles an hour around an oval track, you can kind of stick your head out the window. Maybe you can peek through, and you're probably going to be able to manage it. But if somebody starts telling you to put the pedal down and you start going 50, 60, 80, 100, 120 miles an hour, and you're trying to look out the window or peer through the cracks, and you don't have that visibility to see everything that's
Yeah,
coming at you, you're going to crash and burn really quickly. And so, what he kind of describes is if you want to scale and speed up, you need to create that visibility. And the way you create that visibility is access to systems and data and information that's ready, that's right, that you can trust, and that's going to be real time.
definitely.
Michael, this is a question that's a little bit off the topics that we've kind of been talking about, but I can't help but think about AI in these examples that we're talking about, just because of its ability to give visibility to data and to not have so many siloed pieces like information and things like that. I don't know if you have yet, but have you been a part of any deals where companies had a significant amount of AI integration into their systems? And did that help their value? Did it hinder their value? Do you have any insight on that?
So it's still early kind of in that process to see where it's going to impact on the side of it. But I know we're working with companies today that in the prep side of it, and it's like, okay, how are we going to leverage AI here in this, in our business today? Because we're thinking now, well, where's our headcount cuts or where are we going to increase efficiencies and effectiveness? So where are we going to use this to basically can we drive EBITDA with it? And so like we've got one company I know that they're starting to use it for all their contract research and reviews, you know, saves hours and hours of time and it catches things that they didn't do. So I mean it's a really simple one, but boy, if you can tighten up your contracts or avoid misses, or in the construction space, we're starting to see it in the estimating process. Well, you can pump out more estimates, have opportunity to win more work, and there's more confidence today in is that estimate good, right? My construction clients are always worried when they win a job. Did we get something wrong? Well, now we've got another system in check with it with AI. So well, I think what you're going to see early on is the companies that are adapting it today are going to have a competitive advantage for an extended period of time until it becomes commonplace and just part of what you're doing for business. But right now, if you can be an early mover on it and integrate it into your operations, you're going to see that value. Because if you're talking to a private equity group, as an example, or a buyer, they're looking for where haven't you invested that we can do. So, and they're going to minimize their valuation. But if you've done that already, well, you get the higher value, you get the
Mhm.
higher multiple on it because there's fewer things for them to invest in.
Well, and just to that end, so often, while these valuations are complex, there is a certain element of it that is a multiple on the EBIT the business produces. A lot of these AI tools allow businesses to earn a higher EBITDA. You earn a higher EBITDA,
Exactly.
you're automatically adding dollar. Maybe for every dollar you earn, you could be adding $8 to your valuation. In some cases, more than that. We've seen transactions that are 16 times EBITDA in industries that are really, really hot. So if you are able to increase your EBITDA by using AI or efficiency, you could be significantly changing that valuation. And I think, Michael, to your point, there's a little bit of a blue ocean moment here where if you're the leader of the pack and your EBITDA is the exception to the rule and you're getting that valuation before the market adjusts for it, before
Right.
everybody gets there, and then the multiples come down because we've all implemented that technology, there's kind of a unique moment in time here to capitalize on some of
Definitely.
these efficiencies.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, those 16 multiples, like the insurance industry right now. That's one where AI is going to start to be, there's a bunch of AI companies that are starting to pop up. These smaller mid-size agencies haven't really hit it yet, but the larger ones are. So if you're a mid-size agency and now you're starting to adapt these tools, well, you've now just pushed yourself into that higher multiple range because you've driven that EBITDA and you've also demonstrated the efficiency. So headcount reductions, if that's part of it, or you're just able to do more with less. It has a real big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Going back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, Delcy, how do you feel the best ways to communicate the urgency of improving IT maturity without overwhelming a company that's already behind or a small business? Because it can seem like a very daunting task. So, how do we approach that?
We have found, and in my experience, I've found that a 3 year horizon tends to feel manageable. I think farther out than that, it starts to become too much like it's not a priority or urgency, and too much shorter than that. And I think it just creates too much disruption. Again, depends on how far away the organization is. But if you've got an organization that really has a lot of technical debt, as we often refer to it, that has not been keeping up, building a 3 year horizon to say this is where we want to be in 3 years from now. This is what we want to be true. And often it can be helpful to pick a framework, whether you're required to because of compliance or you just choose one as an elective. There's lots of great frameworks out there that can act as the compass. So we could say, for example, we want to get NIST 800-171 compliant by 2028. Then we're going to work backwards and we're going to say, okay, how do you compare to that framework today? Where's the biggest gaps? And we're going to prioritize those. Oftentimes, we're also going to put a dollar figure on each of those items. So if there's 110 things, you're doing 20%, you have 80% that you're not doing, we're going to put a dollar amount on each one. Depending on where you're at financially and from a kind of budgeting cycle, sometimes organizations like to take the lower dollar items, put them into the current year because they don't have as big an impact on their fiscal planning, and they'll get those done in year one. And then they'll start to put some of the more capital intensive projects in year two and year three so that they have a little bit more time to forecast, to plan, to budget for those items. There are other organizations, though. There are many lending and leasing companies who will come in and say, we will lend or lease the capital needed to do an IT maturity project. And they'll do so often in even 3 to 5 year terms at reasonable financing rates. So that's another approach we've seen organizations take on the financial side. But I think having that clear end goal, 3 year horizon, and then breaking it into 1 year increments of kind of what are the major projects or initiatives that are going to take place in each of these calendar years. And then I think the next key is really sharing that with the whole company, doing some sort of a state of the company address or presentation or roadmap for the whole company. Say, here's our technology roadmap, like software companies have, that say, here are the different things that we're going to make true over the next 3 years and the years they're going to happen in. It creates a little bit of accountability because as long as just a plan on the shelf that you've talked about, the IT company that nobody else knows about, it's really easy to put it off, to delay it, to push it back. Once you've announced to the company, here's our 3 year maturity plan. Here's what you can expect from us. Here's where you're going to need to help because there's often training requirements and policy changes. Sometimes things get a little bit less convenient because we have to put some new security measures in. You create a little bit more of a kind of an adoption and an awareness. People know it's coming. They know why we're doing it. They have the context of how this helps the business in the long run. And there's now accountability where it's much harder to just push off a project or delay something or skip something. It's kind of in a nutshell. I'd say that's kind of our rough approach to how we think about it.
Yeah, makes sense. It makes it like you said, a little bit easier to tackle and doesn't feel so daunting. Somebody sent me in a question. The question could be for either of you. What's one IT investment that always pays off from a valuation standpoint?
Hmm. To me, so looking at it from a practical standpoint, it's always about the CapEx side of it. And that comes back again, kind of that single source of truth, that system. Like if you have outdated systems on how you're running your business, those investments are going to pay off in efficiency. They're going to pay off in, productivity, but they're also going to know for a buyer, they don't have this really big expense coming in because a buyer is looking at the CapEx side, whether it's a piece of equipment or whatever else of what do I need to invest in this business on a go forward basis. So if we can eliminate those CapEx expenditures in the IT side as well as equipment side, we've now improved our EBITDA down the line because a buyer is not hitting it for those, for that amortization on that EBITDA.
Yeah, and I'm going to give you two answers. I'm going to give you a defensive answer and an offensive answer. I think on the defensive side, the biggest risk, and we see this mostly like in manufacturing, is a very antiquated ERP system, one that is no longer supported by the vendor. It's several versions too old, or you've got CNC machines or major equipment on your factory floor that's running on a Windows XP computer. The buyer knows when they look at that, oh my gosh, that is a huge project. It's going to take a ton of time. It's very expensive, and we're not going to see an ROI on it for a minute. That's a huge burden. And oftentimes they'll just take it out of either walk away from the deal or say, we're taking this much out of the transaction to cover for that major cost and expense and disruption. Because it's a big project. So I think from the defensive side, to not get hit there is to make sure that the core systems and software that run your business are maintained to industry standards and they're always supported by a third-party vendor and everything is under some sort of warranty or support program so that it's not just on you to maintain and support it. On the kind of more offensive side, going back to what I was talking about at the beginning, I think this is where the AI, the data, the ability to make really good decisions using really good information, especially if that data is proprietary. Anybody has access to ChatGPT. Anybody can run commands and questions and strategic thinking. But if you've built something that is trained on proprietary data, really rich, really specific data to your industry or to your business, and you've created decision-making dashboards or tools or frameworks that really give you a competitive advantage, I think that's a real value add and something that you can really market in a transaction and potentially demand a higher EBITDA or higher, you'll earn a higher EBITDA or you'll demand a higher valuation depending on if you've capitalized on that fully or not.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think we've talked a lot about kind of, what you can do and what you should do prior to sale. But Michael, do you have any insight about when is the best time in advance of a capital raise or sale when a company should start addressing these things? Because it's probably not a month before. So how long should they give themselves? I mean, it's going to depend on what they're implementing, but what's a good rule
Right.
of thumb?
So we like to look at the world in 3-year blocks of time, and so I know you guys run EOS and that kind of that framework, right? Because first year is a fixed year, year 2 is a build year 3 is kind of a growth scale type of mindset. So when we're looking at timelines and horizons, I like 3 years to do things. When someone comes to me and says, I'm ready to go to market now, okay, I can take you, but I can't maximize your value or optimize your value drivers right now. So if we got a couple years into it, and we're also looking at, from a financial standpoint, like when I was talking about those fluctuations, I want long enough period to show a nice trajectory. And most buyers are going to at least start with that 3-year period. They may go back 5, only for, context on where the company's been. But if I tie that with my growth story, I've got 3 consistent years and I've got good forecasts and all that stuff. It's a good time frame to do it. A lot of our buyers, sellers are also at 5-year windows, which gives us a good window as well. So, but at least 3 is an ideal situation to make progress.
Yeah, the I just learned about this in my grad class, but the Kurt Lewin model of change is unfreeze, move, and refreeze, which is very similar to that EOS 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
All good things come in threes. Those were all of the questions that I had. I'd love to open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute, or if you want to throw some in the chat.
Mary, just expanding a little bit on the question you just asked. The other
Yeah.
thing that we've seen it actually twice very recently, is when a company is going through a transaction, a capital raise, or even a major milestone within the business. Maybe they are applying for a patent or certification. Maybe they are trying to get a drug brought to market. In those moments, you're under a microscope and you have absolutely no tolerance for there to be an issue that's going to potentially set off an alarm bell or a signal. And so I think kind of somewhat related to what you just talked about is there's a time when you need to be perfect. There's a time when things need to run smoothly and cleanly. And it's not just kind of making sure that you've got the right things in place to start that process. It's also having done enough of the foundational work to really minimize the chances that during that moment in time, when you're going through intense due diligence, whether that's because of an acquisition or a raise or some sort of an approval, you can't afford to have something go wrong in that window of time. And that window may be 60 days, it may be 90. They're not usually, multi-year processes, but there are these short little narrow windows that during those time periods, you can't afford to have things go wrong. And there's a certain amount of foundational work that you need to do in advance of that to really minimize that risk.
Yeah, that is a good point.
What I would build on that one, just like because of the almost that need for perfection, is one of if you ask buyers what they look at, what's the biggest factor, the biggest risk factor, of what they're looking for, and there's been surveys on this, 70% of them are going to tell you about the strength of that leadership team. And those types of changes or that you're seeing those transitions demonstrate the strength of that team. So they're looking at, do we have a team we can back that can handle these types of transitions? Are they going to grow us? Because they're really investing in that. And that factor, the leadership team is by far and away the number one factor most cited by buyers as what they're looking at from a risk standpoint, from a capacity standpoint, because that's what they're investing in.
And that's such an interesting
So
point because we've been asked in the due diligence we've done for our clients who are thinking of doing an acquisition. One of the questions that's not on the official checklist that we are giving to the seller, but that we are filling out for the buyer is what does the IT in aggregate tell you about the leadership team? Either about the IT leader or the broader
yeah,
leadership team. And it tells everything. I can look at a network and I can tell you how much they value technology, how risk adverse they are, how much they are willing to invest versus delay, procrastinate versus be proactive. It's all there. And if what you're really trying to do, to Michael's point, is assess the quality of the leadership, the quality of the decisions, the quality of the day-to-day operations, the IT will tell you a lot, as will other aspects of the business. But in an IT evaluation, if I do a thorough 250 questionnaire, I can assimilate all of that and tell you pretty quickly, like, they like to invest, they don't like to invest. They're very risk adverse, they're very risk comfortable. And I can give you a lot of that insight just based on what the technology looks like.
All right. If anybody has any questions, like I said, you guys can feel free to unmute. Um, just looking, we covered a lot. Just looking to see if I have any one last question I can throw out to you guys. Um, we've really covered everything. I don't know, Delcy or Michael, if you have anything, any last minute things you guys want to just mention, or anything you want to talk about.
hmm, that can be dangerous, Mary.
I know.
We can talk about these for a long time.
I know.
I think I would reiterate again that point about the leadership aspect of it because I do look at it as such a critical piece. And to your point, like with the tying into Delsey's point with the IT, it demonstrates their ability to make decisions. And the things that we work on with companies is, well, are they making high quality, decisions? And ignoring IT is definitely a sign that they're not making good decisions because of the business risk. It says equally like if they're not making capex expenditures in new equipment or investing the right way into sales. So it calls into question on what am I buying? And so that's why those companies and those PE groups are so focused on that quality of that leadership team because it's such a tell about everything else going on in the business.
Yeah, and I think the closing thought I would share is over the weekend, I was at a conference with the head of BlackRock, and he was saying he feels very bullish about the next 5 years. He thinks the next 5 years in the American economy are going to be some of the most prosperous, robust, exciting years to be owning and running a business. And a lot of that has to do with there is so much capital in the market right now that needs to find home, whether that's through a minority investment, an acquisition, a merger. There's a lot of money. AI is really coming into maturity, and AI is starting to have real transformative impact, not just kind of flashy, shiny object stuff. And you've got an environment where we're very aware of what are some of the goals and objectives that we can accomplish together. There's more collaboration, there's more clarity, there's a lot of transparency right now in a lot of aspects of where things are going. When you add all that up together, you've got a really great climate to operate in. However, a lot of that will be technology driven. And if you don't have a strong foundation to execute that advantage on, you're not able to take advantage of the opportunities that everybody else will be capitalizing on. I think these 5 next years are going to be make or break for businesses when it comes to IT. I think businesses that have avoided having a mature IT up until this point are going to find that that just doesn't work anymore. You just can't have an organization that is constantly reactive, that is constantly getting hacked, constantly dealing with ransomware. It just won't work because you're not going to be able to capitalize on all the really rich, incredible things that the businesses that have a strong foundation are capitalizing on that are going to be transformational, that are going to change their industry, if not their business. And I think that now is really the time to make this a priority, to get this right, and to participate in what could be very, very prosperous 5 years.
And to kind of the parallel that it comes back to the people side of it. So if you make these investments in this game-changing technology, the thing that we're learning about AI is it's going to require people who have far more creative and thought process and curiosity and all these different skills, these people skills and thinking skills that have kind of been ignored a little bit. So to really maximize your value with that investment, you're going to have to invest in your people so that they can leverage these tools effectively. If you've
And
played
Mike,
around with AI already, you know it's kind of lazy and dumb at times. You need
and you
smart
bring
people
up a
running
really
it.
good point that we haven't really touched on yet, which is great people want to work for great organizations. You're going to have a hard time recruiting the best, the brightest, the most impactful people if your organization is disorganized, if the technology is dated, if they're walking in and feeling like this is the 1980s, this is all legacy, this isn't an environment that wants to invest in the future, you're not going to attract and retain the talent that you are going to need in a high growth, high iteration, high innovation environment, which is what the next 5 years are going to be. And probably the next 100 years are going to be. I think we've moved beyond kind of stability and stagnation. So I think that's another aspect of this is Michael's talked a lot about people are a huge driver of your valuation and of what the acquirer is acquiring. If you don't have an environment that attracts and retains the right people, and I don't just mean culture and benefits and compensation, but I do mean the technology, the environment they're coming into, you're not going to be able to be nearly as competitive. And I think it's just going to be one more blow that's going to keep you from participating in a really exciting time.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think there's, like you guys are both saying, I think there's a really big opportunity for change and you have to embrace it or you're going to get left behind, unfortunately. And as scary as that sounds, I think it's also really exciting if you embrace it. So I think it's a really cool time. Um, with that, it looks like Delsey's bringing back up the PowerPoints. There is the contact information for both Michael and Delsey. If either of you want to reach out to them with any questions that you have or just to follow up on anything that was mentioned here, please feel free to do so. And then we also have a webinar coming up in September about the Modern Sales Toolbox. So we're going to be walking through what we do here at Paragus, how we integrate our sales and marketing teams, the tools that we use, so ZoomInfo, HubSpot, and then we also have a special guest, Katie Cartwright from Madison Marketing Agency, who is going to be walking us through the nitty gritty of HubSpot, how to use sequences for your sales team, and it's going to be a good one. So I will send that in the follow-up email with the recording to this webinar. I will send out the link if any of you want to sign up. And with that, I just want to thank you all for coming. We'll give you back 7 minutes and hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Mary.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.